Verse 1, Matthew chapter 2 says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him." Verse 4 says, "When he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed to their own country another way. Now, it's tempting to rush right through this account as if we already know everything there is to know about it, and never really consider what does this mean for us, what does this mean to us. But I want to visit this little story, this actual event again this morning, hopefully breathe some fresh life into it again. Now, it's important, if I can kind of give you an introduction, it's important that we understand a little bit about Herod, who he was, what his character was, and the nature of the wise men, if we're really going to feel the full weight of the events in the account we just read. Herod wasn't a Jew. Herod was an Idumean. He was appointed by Rome to govern the Judean province. If you read anything about Herod from historians, they paint him as a cruel, a narcissistic, and a paranoid man. He was so paranoid that he actually ordered two of his sons to be executed. According to the historian Josephus, he ordered that two of his sons be executed by strangling to death because there was a rumor going around that they were trying to take his throne. His greatest fear seemed to be that someone would try to take his power away. As both an outsider and a ruthless leader, he wasn't loved by the Jewish people. He wasn't really respected by the Romans either. He was a man who lived under the constant threat, whether real or just perceived, of losing control. So there's Herod on the one hand. On the other hand, this account is really centered around these wise men. And we just quite frankly don't know exactly who they were or what they were. Now, there are all kinds of differing opinions and traditions, but most of the opinions, most of the traditions surrounding the wise men are just that, just opinions and just traditions. You know, we three kings of Orient is probably aren't instead of are. The traditional number that we say of the wise men was that there was three. Of course, that's really only said because there was three gifts. Some have said they were named Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar, but there's absolutely no historical evidence for that. This tradition of the three gifts and the three wise men probably arose because of, obviously, the three gifts. The earliest recorded church traditions, whether they're true or not, suggest that there were 12 men that were accompanied by a great entourage, a great host of servants and assistants. These three have often been referred to as Oriental kings, but again, there's no textual, there's no historical support for this. Now, their access to Herod, their wealth suggests they may have been foreign politicians, foreign political figures, but the truth is we really just don't know. Really, we three kings of Orient probably aren't. The only thing we can say for certain about them is that they were from somewhere east of Jerusalem. And you've heard that they were from Asia. You've heard they were from Asia Minor. We don't know. They were just from somewhere east of Jerusalem. The only thing we can say for certain about them is that they were Eastern men. Even the word translated wise men has a lot of argument about what it actually means. It's the Greek word magoi. It's the Latin version of that is the word magi, of course, from which we get the word magician. Some people say that these men were Eastern sorcerers or Eastern astrologers. Some historians believe that they were foreign sorcerers, while others reject that idea altogether. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus used the Greek word Magi to describe a class of priests and court advisors among the ancient Medes and Persians whose primary task involved studying ancient and sacred texts, as well as watching for movements of planets and stars that might be interpreted as divine messages. I think the most historically supported opinion that we can come to is this idea that these were probably Persian court rulers, men in the Persian court whose primary job was to study ancient text, was to study the heavens for signs from God. But even at that, we can't say that's definitely true. Now, I gave you a little view of Herod and a little view of the wise men so I can kind of set the scene for the story. Having at least some inclination of who they were, I want you to imagine this scene. Imagine a large, unexpected foreign delegation arriving in Jerusalem. Maybe even hundreds, maybe even up to 1,000 people arrives in Jerusalem. These aren't just anyone. These are obviously foreign dignitaries. These are men of influence. Even though we don't know exactly who they were, exactly where they were from, they were men who were obviously dignitaries, men of great influence, men of renown. They were so well thought of, so highly respected. When they came into Jerusalem, they were given an audience with Herod. But unlike everyone else, these wise men, these Magi, they had no intention of stroking Herod's ego. They were on a sacred mission. They only had one interest in mind. Imagine as they come into Herod's presence, Herod is used to being bowed down to. Herod is used to practically being groveled before. But here they come into his presence. They're not interested in any of that. They have one question and one question only. They want to know where the newborn king is. The rightful newborn king. No, they knew that he had been born. They explained to Herod, we know he'd been born because an unexplainable astrological phenomenon has happened in the western sky. We were in the east. We looked in the west and we saw this brand new star that appeared, a star that had never been there before. And we knew that this meant that the King of the Jews had been born. This, of course, was an unthinkable question. Now, put yourself in Herod's position, knowing what kind of man Herod was. This unthinkable question held an unthinkable suggestion. If they're saying, where is the newborn king, the rightful king, what that means is Herod isn't the rightful king. Not only had they come to see him, but they say to Herod, we've come to worship him. Now, Herod knew that his own people would be happy to be rid of him. In fact, Herod ordered that on the day of his death, that many of the rulers in Jerusalem be murdered on the day of his death, so at least somebody would cry when he died. That's the kind of man he was, and now he knows his own people would be happy to be rid of him, yet this group of foreigners, this group of dignitaries, they've traveled untold numbers of miles to come and usher this child to a throne. Herod is an outsider in his own city who the people want to be rid of, but now these outsiders come to the city to usher this king, this toddler king, to the throne. Herod was hated by the people who knew him, but these people were ready to offer their worship, their absolute loyalty to a baby they'd never seen. Don't you think this absolutely got under Herod's skin? How exactly Herod presented himself, I don't know, but verse 3 says that he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And it makes sense that Jerusalem was troubled because when Herod was troubled, Jerusalem should have been troubled. When Herod was in a bad mood, heads rolled, literally. When this group shows up, the news probably spread all across Jerusalem very quickly that this group of eastern men has showed up, and they're asking Herod where the real king is. And knowing Herod's temper, knowing how Herod would react, all of Jerusalem is troubled now because Herod's troubled. He gathered the priests and the scribes to get more information. He asked them that question, okay, where is this Messiah? Where is Christ to be born? They quoted to him from Micah 5, and they answered, in Bethlehem of Judea. So Herod called the wise men, the Magi, back to him, and he called this secret meeting, and he wanted to find out when they had first seen this star. Now, the text doesn't tell us, but if you look later in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 16, you'll find that when Herod gives his order to execute all of the male children, he orders that they're to be executed if they're 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. So that means the wise men must have told him they saw this star around 2 years ago. He finds out from him, then they've seen this star around 2 years ago, and now that he's got the information he needs, he tells them, I've consulted with my advisors, and they said Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. So I want you to go to Bethlehem. I want you to search very carefully for the young child, and I want you to, when you found him, you come back, you bring word to me, because I want to worship him too. Obviously, Herod's only asking them to come back because he has a mischievous plan in mind. He wants to know exactly where to find this child because he wants to exterminate the child. Knowing at least where to look, the wise men departed from Bethlehem, and while on their way home, or while on their way to Bethlehem, this same star reappeared. Evidently, the star had disappeared somewhere in their journey. They knew what it meant. They knew they had to get to Jerusalem because they thought that's where the baby in Jerusalem would be born. But then they get there and they find out it's Bethlehem. Well, as they're on their way to Bethlehem, suddenly that star reappears in the sky. Of course, they were overcome with emotion as the star not only reappeared in the sky, but it moved ahead of them as if it was guiding them to a specific place until the star literally stopped over a very specific little house and shone its light on this little house. The wise men were overcome with emotion, not just because of the star, but because of what it meant. Imagine with trembling hands, pounding hearts, as they entered the house, they come into this little house and they find a small child. The Greek word used here is not baby, it's a small child, probably a toddler. They find a small child there with Mary. He's no longer an infant. They see in front of them the rightful toddler king. And the text tells us when they saw him, they fell to the ground as if they had been forced on their face by some unseen presence. They fell to the ground and they worshiped him. When they were finally able to get up, they began to unpack the treasures they had bought. They presented them to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And that night as they went to bed, now I'm surprised they were even able to sleep that night, but that night as they went to sleep, God spoke to them in a dream and told them not to go back, not to tell Herod anything, but just to go home another way. And that's the way the story ends. One of the most interesting facts I've come across about the wise men this week is how many differing opinions there are on who they were, where they were from, and what they represented. Does it frustrate you maybe just a little bit that we really know so little about them? Don't you kind of want to nail it down? This is who they were. This is where they were from. This is what they were doing. Something hit me this week as I studied this text. I began to wonder, and it kind of came to my mind, maybe this was all intentional. Now, of course, when Matthew wrote this, the people of the day would have understood very, very easily what he was talking about when he said these men from the east, these wise men, these Magi. But even under the inspiration of Scripture, even as God was breathing out this text through Matthew, why didn't God give us more information? Why didn't God tell us more about them? I believe the reason that Matthew, under the inspiration of the Spirit, included so little detail about them is because the story was never about them to begin with. The truth is, no matter where they were from or what position they held, they were not the most important individuals in that room. And that's why Matthew had nothing to say about them. They are who we would have focused on. They are who we would have made sure to include every detail about. But the Spirit of God didn't really give us any detail except for they're from the east and they're wise men. That's all He tells us about them because He knows our tendency to focus on something other than the rightful king. Without the child, there was no story. They were only supporting actors in His story, and I think they knew it, but sometimes we don't. The whole event from beginning to end was about this toddler king, this toddler God. Often when we tell the story, all the attention is on the wise men. What's so funny, when we tell the story of the nativity, we put so much attention on the wise men and they weren't even there. Right? We get so distracted on the wise men that weren't even there till 2 or 3 years later. But even when we tell their story, we get so focused on them, and the reality is their story was about Him. If they were here, when they went home and they told the story, they didn't tell all about their travels and all about what happened. No, I guarantee you when they got home, all they could talk about was, we've seen Him. Not just the King of the Jews, we've seen the King of all the earth. Often in our telling of the story, all the attention goes to the wise men, but I guarantee you when they arrived home, when they told their story, all their attention was on him. They knew it. They weren't the kings. Even if they weren't the kings. He was. You'll notice from the very outset of the story, their whole focus is on him. He was at not only the heart of their story, he was at the heart of their worship. Now I want to ask this question this morning. What can we learn about true worship from the Magi? Number one, I want you to understand that true worship is, maybe I didn't go to the right, there we go. Number one, true worship is responsive. I want to point this whole encounter out, and that this whole encounter was based on the Magi's response to something God revealed. Were it not for the star, they would have never known that Messiah had been born. They're maybe hundreds of miles away. They would have never known about this baby that had been born in Bethlehem. If a star had not appeared in the western sky, if they had not looked up and saw something unique, something different, they would have never known that anything happened. When I say that, you've got to think, who is it that holds the stars? Who hangs them in their place? The obvious answer is it's God who holds the stars. God who puts them into orbit. God who hangs them in the sky. It was God who orchestrated the events that led to this moment. God wrote an unavoidable message in the heavens that they could not overlook. It was God who announced, behold, the toddler king is here. Somehow they knew, and it's likely from their study of the Old Testament prophecies, somehow they knew exactly what this star meant. If you go back to the book of Numbers in chapter 24, a prophecy was given of a star that would rise out of Jacob. How did they know the new king was born? They knew it because of the star. How did they know what the star meant? It was because God had in the Old Testament, had hundreds of years earlier, made it known that a star would rise out of Jacob. It wasn't their wisdom that found him out. It was God's revelation that made the toddler king known to them. Both the what and the when was revealed by God. If these men were Persians, they likely had heard of Daniel's prophecy of 70 weeks. They probably knew how Daniel had prophesied that there would be a very specific amount of time till the birth of the Messiah and the death of the Messiah. If these men were men who studied the Old Testament like we believe they probably were, then they would have known not only that a star would announce his coming, they would have known within some reason that the year to be looking for him to be born. All that's important because their eyes were on the heavens because they were looking for him to appear, but they were only looking because God had said it would happen. What? A star. When? 70 weeks. Where? Bethlehem. And it was all revealed by God. No, they didn't seem to know the prophecy that Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, so they went to Jerusalem. But when they got to Jerusalem, what did they find out? Go to Bethlehem. 1 Peter 1 verse 21 tells us no prophecy ever came by the will of men, but holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. This is what I want you to see. In every way, their response, their worship was a response to God's revelation. As it was, so it is. God's revelation is the basis for our response. Authentic worship is a reply to God regarding what He has revealed of Himself. These Magi, these wise men, no matter how much they knew, no matter how much they understood, they could have never felt their way to God through the darkness. They would have never found Him on their own. So God, through holy men, breathed out scriptures and made an announcement hundreds of years earlier that a star would appear. God made an announcement through Daniel, the general time when they should be looking. God, through the men, through the priests that were in Jerusalem, said, go to Bethlehem. It was all God breathed, that God brought them into the presence of this little child. And in the same way for us, no matter how wise we are, no matter how much we think we know, we could never find our way to God. We would never, in our own minds, in our own imaginations, be able to put together a picture of God that was anywhere close to accurate. So what God did, God stepped out of eternity and He breathed through holy men. He breathed a picture out of Himself in the Word of God. As we worship, we are responding to God's revelation of Himself. God is saying, this is who I am, and we are saying, how beautiful. Authentic worship is a reply back to God regarding what He has revealed about Himself. Worship is chiefly about the worthiness of God. Is there anyone more worthy to receive our adoration than the one who said, "Let there be," and everything was? Is there anyone more worthy of our worship than the one who parted the Red Sea so that His children walked across on dry ground, no mud on their feet? Is there anyone more worthy of worship than a God who would leave the adoration of angels, a God who would leave heaven itself, the very presence of God itself, and come and be born as a human baby, have to have His diaper changed, get sick like we get sick, suffer like we suffer, and eventually, after having lived an absolutely sinless and perfect life, be crucified for it? Is there anyone more worthy of worship than Jesus? Worship is a response to the magnificence of Christ, the magnificence of God. And we'll touch on in a moment, but worship has absolutely nothing to do with how we feel. It has to do with what God has shown to be true of Himself. The word worship, the Greek word in the New Testament, one of the meanings of it actually is to kiss like a dog licks his master's hand. Of course, my little puppies make it into at least one out of every 3 sermons. And they deserve it, okay? When I get home this evening, I can about tell you without doubt, when they hear my truck pull in, if they're not already there, they'll come running to the gate. And they will sit there and they will wag their tails and they'll stick their little noses through the fence just waiting, jumping up and down, just waiting for me to come over there. If I don't go over there and talk to them, when I go and I put the little code in on our lock on the mudroom door, by the time I step in the mudroom door, there will be a against the back door. And they have run around and they have jumped on that door and they are both jumping in unison up and down and falling on each other. And you know, all they want is for me to come and say hello. All they want is me to open that door and for me to just scratch their little heads a little bit. I have, and maybe it's because I feed them, maybe it's because I'm bigger than they are. I don't know what it is, but I have the adoration of those puppies. Literally, the word worship has this idea of like a dog who licks his master's hand, of like a dog who is just so excited because he showed up. Worship is the fruit of adoration, and we will give ourselves to or for whatever it is that we adore. We adore God, or we at least should adore God, because we know Him, and we only know Him because He has made Himself known, just like He made Himself known to the wise men, and they responded by coming to worship. Because He has made Himself known to us, our response must be worship. Worship is a response, the only right response to revelation. Revelation is God saying, "Here I am." Worship is us responding, "And how beautiful you are." There's a second thing I want you to see, and that is that true worship is intentional. Now, I highly doubt, maybe I'm wrong, but I highly doubt that any human has ever offered a sacrifice of praise by accident. When the wise men appeared before Herod, what did they say they were there for? They didn't say that we've come to see a show. They didn't even say we've come to see the child, did they? Notice they said, when they appeared before Herod, they said, "We have come to worship the one who was born King of Israel." They didn't come to be entertained. They came not to get something, but to give something, not to ask for something, but to offer something. Worship was the whole reason for their journey. They came to Him with the intent of bowing before Him. He was why they went through so much trouble, why they traveled such a distance. They sought Him because of who He was, not what He could do for them. They came to Him on purpose, with one purpose in mind. And their whole purpose in coming to Him was not to ask Him, "Can you do this favor for me?" Or "Can you make sure this works out?" Their whole purpose in coming to Him, they told Herod, "We have come because we want to lay flat on our face in front of Him." True worship is rarely, if ever, accidental. It may be spontaneous, but it will hardly, if ever, be accidental. True worship happens when we respond to the truth that God has revealed by willingly bending our hearts in His direction. It's an odd thing in an age when worship has become a billion-dollar industry, that truth has become so cheap. Now worship is about the experience of the Christian rather than the excellency of Christ. Whenever I hear somebody say, the worship just didn't do anything for me this morning, my first thought was, it wasn't supposed to. True worship is never solely about how we feel. It is always primarily about who He is. And if our worship is in any way dependent on our emotions or our experience, it will be undependable at best. And even worse, it may be unacceptable to God. The idea that worship has to do with how it makes us feel is, quite frankly, idolatry. Worship is an intentional response to what we know to be true of God, what we know to be true about God. And what we know to be true about God is not governed by the ambiance in the room. It's not controlled by the atmosphere. What God has revealed to be true of Himself is true. It was true. It is true. And it always will be true, no matter how we feel in the moment. It's always true regardless of situation or location. If we only worship or can only worship in certain contexts, then we're not worshiping, we're just performing. Allow David to give a testimony from the cave as he was being run down by Saul. Or think about Paul and Silas as they sang praise to God in the prison. What about John, who on Patmos worshiped the Savior? Or even these wise men, they're not in a cathedral. They are in a carpenter's cottage in Bethlehem, yet intentionally they bow before Him because who God has revealed Him to be. Their worship was not inspired by the setting or by the mood. It wasn't smoke. It wasn't dim lights. It was an overflow response of what they knew to be true about God, regardless of the venue. If worship is based only on feelings, then it will always face two dangers on two fronts. For those who are naturally more emotional, worship will become a me-centered experience that is craved not because He is the born King, but because I need to fill some empty space in my emotional tank. And the reality is that is not worship. That's a transaction. That's saying, God, I will sing to you a song as long as you give me a feeling. That's not worship. On the other hand, for those who are less emotional, worship has the tendency of becoming irregular because, well, I just don't feel anything, so I can't worship because I'm not feeling it. May I frankly say, how we feel doesn't change a thing about who God is. Now, certainly, don't misunderstand me. Certainly, our emotions should be involved in our worship. We're to love Him with the whole heart. But the point I'm trying to get across this morning, certainly our emotions should be involved in our worship, but our worship should never be based on our emotions. I would dare say that every one of the Magi who gathered around the baby had different psychological makeups, yet they simultaneously knelt before Him because of who they knew Him to be. See, worship is an intentional response of the will to who He is. Doesn't matter how you feel. Doesn't matter where you are. Worship is intentionally bowing yourself before Him because of who He is. For some, your worship may be more emotional and more expressive. For others, it may be less. But for all of us, there has to be a willing choice made in a willing heart to bow before the one who has been born King. They came to worship Him, not because it was convenient, but because He was worthy. Worship must often begin with an intentional choice we make, not an overwhelming feeling we feel. Number three, a third thing I want you to see about worship that we can learn from them is that true worship, I must have got off somewhere. Number three, true worship is sacrificial. Worship, may I say, worship is always sacrificial. There is no such thing as an offering without a sacrifice. And by that I mean one cannot worship without surrendering something. Let me turn again to the wise men to illustrate. Their first offering was a sacrifice of pride. Falling down was in itself an offering that they lifted up. These were the wisest, possibly the wealthiest men of their day. Yet one look at this toddler king made them lose absolutely all self-respect and just fall down on their face flat in front of him. The Greek word, when it says they fell down, is so interesting because it's not just that they got down on their knees, but literally it's like they were drawn to the ground in his presence. One glimpse of him affected something deep within them that literally forced them to the ground. The only way to lift him up was for them to get low. And they were great men. They probably had on nice clothes. They probably were men of renown, men who had a lot of respect. But when they saw him, they lost all self-respect and they just laid on the ground in front of him because he was the king. In his presence, they didn't think of themselves as high and mighty. They saw themselves as unworthy and undeserving of any audience with the king. You see, worship that is not accompanied by humility is not worship at all. Worship that is not accompanied by humility is not worship at all. Again, that word, the Greek word is proskuneo. It literally means to prostrate oneself in homage, to lay out before someone because you have such reverence for them, such a holy fear of them. Here these grown men have a holy reverence, a holy fear of a toddler. Among the Persians, worship meant to fall upon the knees, to touch the ground with the forehead as an expression of profound reverence. Sometimes we get the idea that worship is only a physical act, and certainly it can and it should be expressed physically and externally. But before worship can be expressed externally, it must be experienced internally. Before you bow your body, there must be a bowing of your heart. A realization, he is worthy of so much more than I can give. And because he's so worthy, because I want to lift him up, I'll get just as absolutely low as I can go to show him how much I value him. In John 4, remember Jesus said that true worshipers must worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is seeking such to worship him. I believe that there should be raising of the hand. I believe that. But before you raise your hands, bow your heart. True worship is first a bowing of the heart before it is a bending of the body. Peter wrote to the church that we are to sanctify. We are to set the Lord apart in our hearts. He is to be special. He is to be holy. He is to be high. He is to be revered just like these Magi revered the toddler. External worship is important, but what I want you to understand is that internal worship must precede external worship. Worship that does not begin in the heart will never be acceptable, no matter how high the hands are raised. Internal worship should at times produce external worship. You know, there's times when I'm standing over here and I have this little argument with God. And this is the argument. We're singing a song, we're singing some truth about God, and I don't have any great feeling. I just know that this is true about him, and I think, well, I need to get on my knees. And I always have this argument, well, Lord, if I get on my knees, then people are going to see, and they're going to think I'm just doing it for show. I was in a meeting a while back, and I felt the need to get on my knees, and it was in a place where I can tell you what, nobody else was going to get on their knees. And I just felt this need to get on my knees and worship. And I had that little argument with God. Well, God, I don't want them to think I'm just doing it for show. I don't, all that kind of stuff. And the one thing I always hear playing over and over in my mind when I'm having that argument is, am I worthy or not? Am I worthy of it or not? And this is what always happens. There's always a moment where I bow my heart and I say, yes, God, you're worthy. And after I bow my heart, it just becomes natural to get on my knees. I want you to raise your hands. I want you to sing and rejoice and dance. I want you to do all that, but not with your body before you've done it in your heart. Internal worship should at times produce external worship. It just seems natural to run and jump for joy when we see something or someone that we love. When those puppies see me, they run and they jump, but it's because they recognize me. They know me. They want to be with me. Pastor Dave is laughing because maybe I'm coming over that dogs really can feel emotion. All I'm trying to get across to you is he is so deserving of our worship. I'm not even going to belabor the point, but their second offering was not just their sacrifice of their own pride. And I think that's the greatest sacrifice most of us have to make, is a sacrifice of our pride. It doesn't matter what anybody thinks about us. All that matters is what we think about him. Their second offering was a sacrifice of possession, and I will say the first must always precede the second. One without the other is like a fire without wood. It doesn't matter what you give. If what you're giving is only coming from the hand and not from the heart, it's not an acceptable offering of worship. To the observer, though, their offering probably seemed expensive and extravagant. I mean, look what they're giving to a child. It just seems so unreasonable, but to them it was just reasonable service because they knew who he was and why he came. At the heart of worship, there's only one thing. And it's not music, and it's not men. Men might lead us in worship. Music might be a venue we use to get to worship. But at the heart of worship, you'll neither find music nor men. At the heart of worship, there's only one thing, and there's only room for one thing, and it's him. Worship's not about our experience. Worship is about his excellence. And whether I feel anything or not doesn't matter. All that matters is am I giving him what he's worthy of. And you know this to be true. It is amazing. We were made for worship. And it's an amazing thing when we do what we're supposed to do, how our feelings come along. When we worship him, when we give him the glory he's worthy of, that's actually what we were made to do. And it's amazing how we'll begin to be satisfied in him as we worship him. It's the full circle. Worship, though, isn't about how we feel. It's about him. It's not about our experience. It's about his excellence. But I guarantee you, if you get lost in his excellence, it'll be an experience. The wise men of every age always seem to get this one thing right, even when everyone else forgives it, even when everyone else forgets it, and that's this: Jesus is at the heart of worship.